All right, this is part 3, I think, of part 1, chapter 2. No, okay, so part 1, chapter 2, part 3. Yeah, okay, it shouldn't be so long. I think it's just barely, it's not even a page. All right. There are not over 100 people in the United States who hate the Catholic Church. There are millions, however, who hate what they wrongly believe to be the Catholic Church, which is, of course, quite a different thing. Those words are as true today as they were in the 1938, when Fulton J. Sheen, then a Monsignor, wrote them. When the scandal hit the front page of the newspapers in 2002, a Wall Street Journal NBC News poll found out that 64% believed that Catholic priests frequently abused children. 10 years later, it was found that only 21% of Catholics could correctly identify that the abuse cases were more common before 1985 than since. Bishops and pastors share much of the blame for this ignorance. It is their job to educate the faithful, but few give homilies that mention anything about the progress that has been made. In 2018, a CBS poll asked respondents about the seriousness of priestly sexual abuse. Here are the results. Very serious, 69%. Somewhat serious, 21%. Not that serious, 7%. Don't know or no answer, 4%. If this question had been asked between the mid-1960s and the mid-1980s, the results would likely have been the reverse. We would expect that approximately 7% would say there is a very serious problem, and a roughly 69% would say that the problem is not that serious. Here's the paradox. The timeline just cited is exactly the period when most of the sexual abuse of minors took place, but few were aware of it. Today, there is almost no abuse taking place, yet alarms are going off. In the spring of 2019, a Pew Research Center survey found that 8 in 10 Americans believed that Catholic clergy sexual abuse was an ongoing problem, while only 12% said that these problems happened in the past and most likely didn't happen anymore. A quarter of Catholics, 24%, held to their latter interpretation. As disturbing as this misperception is, even worse is the fact that many prominent Catholic leaders refuse to challenge this distorted view. At a lay leadership conference held in 2019 at Georgetown University, the Pew data were discussed, but no one bothered to correct the record. The data dispute the invidious perception that the scandal is ongoing. In November 2019, NBC released an interesting survey of Catholics who work for the church in one capacity or another. It found that almost 4 in 10, 39%, said that sexual abuse scandal is still a major problem, and 14% said it is no longer a major problem, and 46% said that this was never more of a problem for the Catholic Church than it has been for other institutions involved in the care of minors. Nuns were most alarmed and most uninformed, with 56% believing that it is still a major problem today. In the televised documentary on the survey, NBC gave me an opportunity to set the record straight. This is a result of the poisoning of the public mind, I said. Most of the bad guys, most of the priests who molested are either dead or out of ministry. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. That is the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3: The Poisoning of the Public Mind. In 2018, I did a radio interview with John Steigerwald, a well-known Pittsburgh personality, about clergy sexual abuse. He said that in all his years in Catholic schools, he's never heard of any case of priestly molestation. That is hardly unusual. The number of offending priests is very small, yet he received a barrage of criticism for what he said. This is telling. It shows that many people believe, despite the facts, that the number of offending priests is large. What accounts for this poisoning of public mind? 4 factors explain why the public perception of the scandal is distorted. The role explains why the public perception of the role of the media, the role of Hollywood, the role of Pennsylvania grand jury report, and the role of victim lawyers and advocates. The role of the media. When it comes to the church, some in the media never seem to give credit to where credit is due. Take, for example, a remarkable 2019 editorial in the Washington Post accusing the church of failing to report molesters. It said, the past predations and cover-ups are often revealed by journals, government authorities, or victims of their advocates, but rarely by the church itself. It gave, by way of example, news that former Cardinal Theodore McCaverick was a molester. It was a lousy example. It was Cardinal Timothy Dolan who outed McCarrick, not the media. It was his independent regulations and compensation program that secured information from a McCarrick victim, and it was Dolan who made it public. How many rapists who works in the media think of CBS and NBC have had one of their senior officials turn them in? None. The media are aware that the number of molesting priests is minuscule compared to what it was decades ago, but instead of acknowledging this, many reporters and commentators seek new ways to besmirch the church. Here's how the games are played. In 2019, a law firm, Seeger Weiss, tallied the amount of money the church spent on lobbyists in the States, and the findings were picked up by the media. The most egregious story of them all was in the USA Today. According to the 2 reporters who wrote this piece, it was callous, if not cruel, for the bishops to fight legislation that singles out the Catholic Church under a law that suspends the statute of limitation in sexual abuse cases. Whenever an organization is under attack, the leaders bring in the public relations experts, lawyers, and lobbyists to minimize the damage. This is doubly true when the attack is unfair. It would be shocking if they did not. The media certainly do this when they are hit with a scandal. Why, then, do they act in horror when they learn that the Catholic Church employs the same people? It is unmistakable message that the Catholic Church has no business in acting in self-defense. What made the USA Today article so astonishing is that as recently as December 2016, it did a really good job of exposing sexual abuse in public schools. Yet it never once mentioned public schools in its story on the Catholic Church. If it were fair, it would have said that the changes in the statute of limitations almost never apply to public schools. Just think that what would happen if the reverse were true. What if public schools were being singled out for scrutiny and religious institutions were given a pass? The public school will pull out all the stops, and who would blame them? This raises a relation question. Why are public schools exempt from statutes of limitations when statutes of limitations are extended, unless the explicit explicitly stated otherwise, the public sector is protected by what is known as the doctrine of sovereign immunity. This means that all alleged victims of sexual abuse in the public schools has just 90 days to file a claim. After that, there is no means of redress. This rule resulted from a power exercise by the public school unions and their friendly lawmakers in the state capitals. Guess who gets the union money at election times? When the statute of limitation is revised and allowed for a look-back period, allowing alleged victims to file suit for offenses that happened decades ago, this provision does not apply to the public sector. In other words, the law intentionally discriminates against private sector and more often than not against the Catholic Church alone. Even when the look-back provision includes public schools, making them vulnerable to lawsuits, as happened in New York with the Child Victims Act. Most of the suits are still filed against the Catholic Church. Why? Because teachers' records usually do not state why a problem teacher was moved to another school district or terminated. Moreover, the multiple layers of the public school bureaucracy that attorneys must traverse in pursuit of damaging information make the Catholic Church a much easier target. Add to this the ideological factor, anti-Catholic bias, and the last social acceptable prejudice. The media has a tendency to tell old stories of abuse while giving impressions that the abuse is still ongoing. Wisconsin Public Radio did this in November 2019. The next month, so did CNN. Neither Wisconsin Public Radio nor CNN mentioned that the number of sustained current cases against the clergy is almost non-existent. That would get in the way of its condemnation of the church. The CNN story was so inaccurate that it provoked me to raise a question. Why does CNN hate the Catholic Church? Of course, the news outlets could run scores of stories about sexual abuse in other institutions, but they rarely do. The USA Today came close to when it gave Wisconsin Public School an F for the way they share information about abusive teachers who are released to another school, but it failed to run a separate story about teachers themselves. The next month, CNN followed with a story of its own on old cases in the Catholic Church. The public does not think too highly of the media. One reason for this is the tendency of reporters to write sensationalized or one-sided stories. In 2018, an AP interviewed Catholics who appeared before one of the diocese's review boards tasked with assessing claims of sexual abuse. Every person interviewed had something negative to say. Moreover, there was no summary data. The entire article was based on anecdotes. Also, the article tried to make victims out of the accusers simply because they were grilled by lawyers representing the church. Accusers should be grilled. When someone makes a serious charge about a priest who may not even be alive or anyone else, it is the burden on the accuser to make a credible case that demands vigorous questionings. Naturally, the AP never indicated that the accused priests have due process rights that need to be respected. In addition to condemning the church for defending itself, the media also condemns the church for not policing priests it has kicked out. No other institution is held to this standard. Yet in the last quarter of 2019, there were several such stories. The AP led off in October with the results in 9-month investigation of former priests who were credibly accused of sexual misconduct. It is concluded that when a priest is released from ministry, the church does not keep tabs on him. True, neither does any other institution nor organization monitors employees let go for sexual misconduct. The AP also found fault for the church because some priests who were defrocked took jobs in public schools or any other profession working with young people. Why is this the church's fault? Shouldn't the fault lie with those doing the hiring? Are they not responsible for performing background checks? The most astonishing criticism was to hammer the church for not listing as sex offenders priests who have been released from ministry for alleged but not proven misconduct. Are the reporters aware that no accused person is listed as a sex offender unless he has been convicted? It is not certain whether this was a sheer ignorance or anti-Catholic bias. In November 2019, USA Today published the result of its 9-month investigation on the same topic and employed 39 reporters to write about 85-year-old priest who was accused for abuse in the 1970s. Was there more to the story? No, that was it. The story was also quoted someone who was disturbed to learn that the accused priest who lives near him in Florida was not on the sex offender registry. Apparently, it never occurred to the reporters that since he was never found guilty, he doesn't have to register as a sex offender. As with the AP reporters, it is not clear whether ignorance or bigotry was operative. When WCPO TV Cincinnati, as ABC affiliate, did a story on the church's failure to supervise former priests accused of sexual misconduct, I addressed it, pointing out that its shortcomings. Fortunately, a resident of Cincinnati read what I said and alerted me to something I did not know. WCPO fired one of its investigative reporters, Stephen Hill, for sexual misconduct. My own investigation found that he was released from prison in 2009. A general manager at the time refused to talk to the Cincinnati Enquirer about any potential employment opportunities Hill might have. The station did nothing to supervise him. In 2020, ProPublica, a liberal non-profit investigative internet outlet funded by prominent foundations, teamed up with the Houston Chronicle to do another one of these stories on accused priests who have left the church. Do these media outlets expect the Catholic Church that the Catholic Church should put a tracking device on former accused priests so that the media can monitor them? ProPublica even boasted that it developed an interactive database to search for accused priests. It did not tell us why it did not develop one of the former accused public school employees. Excuse me. Not all reporters are as bad as referenced here, but unfortunately there are too many who are either incompetent or biased or both. These journalists contribute to the perception that the scandal is still ongoing, thereby distorting the truth. The role of Hollywood. In 2013, after two Muslim brothers bombed Boston, everyone from Boston Archbishop Sean O'Malley to Secretary of State John Kerry implored Americans not to blame all Muslims. It was good advice. Others went further, saying that Islam had nothing to do with it. The Southern Poverty Law Center ridiculed the idea that radical Muslims had anything to do with the carnage, accused by those who had been such observations as blaming the boogeyman. Moreover, there are no jokes or snide remarks about Muslims on any of the late-night talk shows. Everyone following the lead established by President George W. Bush after 9/11 do not make wild generalizations blaming Muslims for the behavior of few terrorists. This kind of reaction stands in stark contrast to the way priests are spoken about in wake of the scandal. The vilest jokes are made about priests in general, blaming the clergy as a whole for offenses of a few. Not surprisingly, this leaves the public with perception that nothing has changed. The perception is flawed. But sociologist W.I. Thompson said, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. Hollywood has certainly contributed to the most vicious portrayals and stereotypes of the Catholic Church. Much of that has to do with the entertainment industry animus against Christianity in general. Michael Med, Michael Medved has tracked the hostility better than anyone. He says fingers are anyone, and he fingers a secular bubble in Hollywood. The problem here is that the media reflects the lives of a tiny portion of Americans, and then broadcasts that reflections to everybody. He says, bringing Christianity to Hollywood is like bringing the most remote reaches of Ecuador, where people have never ever encountered anything like this before. It has been like this for a long time. In 1997, John Dart wrote a piece for Los Angeles Times saying that Hollywood and organized religion have been regarding each other with deep suspicion and sometimes even hostility since the days of flickering silence. Actress Jennifer O'Neill put it in succinctly, 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 I don't know, succinctly, when she said, if you mention Jesus Christ in Hollywood, all hell breaks loose. In 2021, actor Kevin Sorbo noted that being a Christian and a conservative in Hollywood is kind of like being a double leper. Mel Gibson learned this lesson when he tried to find a studio for Passion of the Christ. Television producers are very careful not to stereotype minorities and homosexuals, but when it comes to priests, they relentlessly promote the most obscene portrayals. South Park can be fun to watch, but when it depicts priests as predator, it shows its dark side. For many years, women on TV, on The View, especially Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and Elizabeth Hasselbeck, ripped the church with abandon, all under approved eye of producer Barbara Walters. For decades, David Letterman, Jay Leno, Jon Stewart, and Trevor Noah used their late night talk shows to smear priests, but none other can top Bill Maher, whose filthy remarks are legendary. Among filmmakers, Harvey Weinstein and his brother Bob are some Hollywood's biggest Catholic bashers. Priest, Dogma, 40 Days and 40 Nights, Magdalene Sisters, Philomena. These films are all stereotype priests or religious and ridiculed Catholicism. The Magdalene Sisters deliberately misrepresent the Magdalene laundries in Ireland, which are home run by nuns for dispossessed, often wayward girls and women. Most of the residents were well treated. No one was murdered, imprisoned, or forced to say. There were no slave labor. Not a single woman was sexually abused by a nun. The harsh treatment portrayed by the Magdalene sisters is a lie. How do we know? Because the evidence is fully documented in what we know as the McCalise report, a government effort to get the truth. Similarly, the movie Philomena is a fabrication. The film maintains that Philomena Lee was forced to give up her son by greedy nuns and that she eventually found him under the United States. In fact, she voluntarily gave up her son when neither she nor family could provide for him, and she signed a contract granting custody to the nuns when she was 22. She never found her son. He died in 1995 and was buried on the grounds of the very covenant that welcomed her when she was in need. She did not look frantically for him for 50 years, as the film claims. Indeed, the first time she set foot in the United States was November 2013, when she went to Los Angeles to hawk her movie. What is perhaps most infuriating about Hollywood's depictions of predatory priests is its refusal to offer a movie like Spotlight on sexual abuse in Tinseltown. Boston producer Matthew Valentinas wanted to draw attention to the pedophilia ring that dot Hollywood, and to do that, he enlisted Amy Berg to do the film. She is a veteran. She was nominated for an Oscar for her documentary about molesting priests, Deliver Us from Evil. Berg's film, An Open Secret, is a devastating look at the way Hollywood predators manipulated, intimidated, and raped aspiring child actors. The rapists were not strangers, they were mentors. To be specific, they were managers, publicists, and agents, men who were held in high esteem by everyone, including the child actors and models whom they molested. Valentinas assumed it would not be hard to find distributors interested in the film. He was wrong. We approached most studios and everyone passed. We thought we have a great director. Everything was clear and legally vetted. Why would it be a risk for a company to take it? No one would. This went on for years. Finally, the movie opened in a few cities, but it was never given a wide release. The resistance was strong across the board. The Hollywood elite had no interest in spotlighting its own decadence. Alright, read a couple more pages. I'll read just this part. And this part is also long. Oh, we're almost there. The role of Pennsylvania grand jury. The finding of Pennsylvania grand jury reports in 2018 received unprecedented attention, and the report did more to advance the false perception that nothing has changed than a single factor in recent times. It is hard for the truth to surface amid all negative chatter. On August 14th, 2019, Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro released a grand jury report on the 6 of the 8 Catholic dioceses in the state. News stories said he found evidence of 301 priests who abused more than 1,000 children over a period of 70 years. As I said at the time, these stories were thrice false. Not all the alleged offenders were priests. 2. 1. Not all the alleged offenders were priests. 2. Most of the alleged victims were adolescents, not children. And 3. The report was not evidentiary, it was investigative, meaning that the accused priests were never given the opportunity to rebut the charges. Moreover, roughly 3% of the allegations took place after the 2002 Dallas reforms were adopted. So much for the scandal being ongoing. Importantly, nothing could be done about most of those who were actually guilty. Almost all of the accused were either dead or had been thrown out of the priesthood. As I noted at the time, this was rarely acknowledged. No wonder Shapiro was able to prosecute only 2 priests. He knew this from the get-go, but he used the report to push for a suspension of the statute of limitation. Never once did he insist that public schools to be treated in the same way. The narrow focus on the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania began more than a decade before Shapiro's efforts. It started when Philadelphia District Attorney Lynn M. Abraham became the first prosecutor in Pennsylvania to use a grand jury system to expose decades-old clergy sex abuse. She started her probe in 2001 and issued a report in 2005. She was given specific charge to investigate sexual abuse of minors in all religious organizations, yet she probed only the Catholic Church. On March 31st, 2011, I sent Abraham a letter via overnight mail. I was quite specific. In the grand jury report of September 26, 2001, 1st Judicial District Criminal Trial Division, it says that the grand jury was charged to investigate the sexual abuse of minors by individuals associated with religious organizations and denominations. You were the district attorney at the time. Could you identify which religious organizations and denominations you pursued other than the Roman Catholic Church? It is important to process that we ascertain accurate information. She never replied. Abraham never prosecuted a single priest. She knew from the beginning that she was constrained by the statutes of limitation, but she was able to use her grand jury report to smear the Catholic Church in the press, much to the applause of Philadelphia Inquirer. Giving all other religions a pass is in clear violations of her mandate. In 2011, Abraham's successor, Seth Williams, picked up where she left off, trying to bring down the Archbishop of Philadelphia. He too failed to nail the Catholic Church, but the courts did not fail to nail him. In 2017, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for accepting a bribe. More important is the damage he did to the innocent man relying on the bogus tales of Danny Gallagher, aka Billy Doe, who claimed victim status. Journalist Ralph Soprano described Gallagher as a former drug addict, heroin dealer, habitual liar, third-rate con man, and thief who made the whole story up, and all four men who went to jail, including a priest who died there, were innocent. Soprano was telling the truth. In fact, he deserved a Pulitzer Prize for his yeoman's work. One of the most outrageous aspects of the media coverage of the 2018 grand jury report was its failure to explain what triggered the report in the first place. It was not law enforcement that found a guilty party. It was a bishop who started it. In November 2011, Bishop Mark Barczak, who headed the Diocese of Altoona Johnstown, learned of offenses committed by Brother Stephen Baker in the 1990s at Bishop McCourt's Catholic High School in Johnstown. He immediately notified the authorities. The police never contacted Cambria County District Attorney Kathleen Callahan. The police never contacted Cambria County District Attorney Kathleen Callahan, but once she learned of this case, she decided not to start a grand jury probe. Instead, she asked for the state investigation handling the matter over to Attorney General Kathleen Kane. Now imagine for a moment if a public school superintendent in central Pennsylvania were to turn in a teacher who was believed to have sexually abused a student. Imagine further that the local district attorney decides to contact the state attorney general instead of conducting its own probe. And this leads to an investigation of every school district in the state, and that in turn triggers a state investigation of public schools throughout the nation. It wouldn't happen, not in a million years. It should be noted that Shapiro stepped in after Kate was sentenced to prison in 2016 for leaking sealed, confidential grand jury documents unrelated to the Catholic Church. Unrelated to the Catholic Church to the media, and then lying under oath. What did Shapiro get for his efforts? He knew that the statute of limitations stopped him from prosecuting most of those who were guilty, but his goal seemed to be more about shaming the church, especially since he let every other institution off the hook. The reaction of many conservatives who were otherwise thoughtful writers to the grand jury report was astounding. George Will began his triad against the Catholic Church by making false charges. Horseplay, a term to denote child rape is wait a term to denote child rape is, says Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro, part of a sinister glossary of euphemisms by which the Catholic Church's obfuscates wait bureaucracy obfuscates the Church's pattern of abuse and conspiracy of silence. But most of the alleged victims were not children. Most of them were not raped. Inappropriate touching, which is indefensible, was the typical offense. Also, the word horseplay was not part of the lexicon church officials. It appeared once in more than 1,300 pages of the report, and it was used to describe the behavior of a Samaritan. Making a distinction between minor sexual infractions and rape is fairly standard practice in the media. CBS journalist Leslie Stahl insists on it, arguing that those found guilty of minor offenses should not have their lives destroyed as a result. Yet, when I drew that distinction, noting that most of the alleged victims were not raped, journalist Andrew Ferguson was incensed, claiming that the grand jury report was pile high with factual claims. And this, in fact, none of what is in a grand jury report should be assumed to be factual. Former Harvard Law professor Dan Dershowitz knows better. The grand jury has a specific function. It is supposed to only indict or not indict. Indeed, prosecutors generally don't issue reports for that reason, because they only hear one side of the case. They don't hear the other side. There's no cross-examination of witnesses. That's why it is regarded as wrong for prosecutors to issue reports. It's precisely because the grand jury reports are not factual that the Catholic League filed an amicus brief challenging the right to the Pennsylvania grand jury reports to make public names of 11 priests who claimed that doing so would violate the reputational rights as guaranteed by the state constitution. On December 3rd, 2018, our case, handled by Pittsburgh lawyers from Jones Day, won. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court ruled 6-1 in our favor. In November 2019, a Pennsylvania Supreme Court task force, which had been impaneled 2 years earlier, vindicated our effort. It recommended establishing grand jury reports. Even some Catholics of a more liberal bent saw through the grand jury report. Former New York Times religion reporter Peter Steinfeld took it apart piece by piece to declare, as the report said, all victims were brushed aside in every part of the state by church officials who preferred to protect the abusers and their institution above all. Was inconceivable. He called it grossly misleading, irresponsible, inaccurate, and unjust. He also referred to the report as a weapon in the debate over this issue, citing its ugly, indiscriminate, and inflammatory rhetoric and unsubstantiated charges. To say nothing of the evidence in the report ignores, he concluded, that this was truly unworthy of judicial body that is responsible for impartial justice. Steinfeld aptly saw that the use of grand jury as a weapon was picked up by several states, some of which went beyond revising the statutes of limitation. They sought to break the seals of confessional lawmaking of the confessional. Lawmakers in Kentucky, Maryland, Kansas, Nevada, and Mississippi pursued the attempts to end the priest's penitent privilege, all in the name of learning about the cases of sexual abuse. Hypocrisy was shown glaringly in the New Hampshire, when the state assembly voted to end the priest's penitent privilege while expressly keeping the protections of the attorney-client privilege. Most of the protracted confrontation occurred when California legislators sought to break the seal of the confessional. The efforts to stop the bill was led by Los Angeles Archbishop Jose Gomez. The Catholic League also played a role in mobilizing tens of thousands of Catholics to email the state lawmakers. I personally asked California State Senator Jerry Hill, who sponsored the bill, to provide my office with documents to support the claim that the clergy penitent privilege has been abused on a large scale, resulting in underreported and systematic abuse of children across multiple denominations and faiths. He could not, and in the end he gave up and withdrew his bill. I guess that'll be the end of part 1 of chapter 3.